Parliamentary sittings often dominate the news cycle, as politicians of all stripes jostle to get their attention-grabbing stunts in front of voters. Perhaps more importantly, Article 9 of the Bill of Rights holds that the freedom of speech and debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Parliament. What is said in Parliament is uniquely protected. As a result, it is often used as a venue to air allegations that may otherwise be subject to defamation proceedings, or to make statements that would not be able to be made publicly. While the proceedings of Parliament are interesting to the media, there is little attention paid to the official record of these proceedings. Hansard, transcripts of debate in a Parliament, are mostly of interest to historians or lawyers attempting to determine why a Parliament enacted a particular law. On one occasion, however, the Hansard record of debate in the Queensland Parliament was so contentious that it became a national news story and nearly ignited a dispute between a state and federal government. The famous quote about Australia's commitment to the First World War comes from Andrew Fisher, Prime Minister at the war's beginning, who said that Australia would stand beside our own to help and defend Britain to the last man and the last shilling. Australia's attitude towards the war was generally optimistic, except for a small contingent originally sent by the pre-Federation colonies during the tail end of the Second Boer War. The teenage nation had no real experience in war. If the rhetoric from the time is to be believed, Australians were eager to travel overseas to defend the mother country and earn their place on the world stage. As time went on, however, support for the war cooled. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign in 1915 was particularly damaging, as thousands of young men were sent to their deaths thousands of kilometres from home. Enlistments collapsed from 124,000 in 1916 to 45,000 in 1917. Consistently high casualty rates left holes in Australian divisions which the British demanded be filled. Australia, by that stage, was in the minority by not having brought in conscription. Australia already had conscription in the event of domestic conflict, but there was no precedent for sending conscripts overseas. Coupled with doubts about the endorsement of such measures by the Parliament, the government decided that they would earn a mandate by putting the question to the Australian people. On June 16, 1915, Labor Prime Minister Billy Hughes remarked in Parliament, "In no circumstances would I agree to send men out of this country to fight against their will. If the day ever comes when men will not fight when their country is at death grips, it will be because the country is rotten to the core and not worth fighting for." A year later, Hughes would announce his intention to bring in conscription. In the best Labor traditions, however, Hughes' mode of doing so, which required extensive compromise in order to be endorsed by the Parliamentary Labor Party, impressed no one. Leslie Jauncey explains in The Story of Conscription in Australia that the anti-conscriptionists did not like the proposal, for it contained the possibility of conscription in it, and the conscriptionists did not like it because they wanted compulsion without a referendum. Having earned by the smallest of margins the support of the Labor caucus, Hughes set about enticing the state Labor executives to endorse the vote. In Melbourne, he told the Victorian executive that the war would be over soon, that not many men would be conscripted, and that it would be a blow to German psychology. He made no mention of the elephant in the room, which was the collapse of voluntary enlistments. The Victorian executive overwhelmingly rejected his proposal. In Sydney, Hughes took a different tack, posing to the delegates the danger of what was later known as the Yellow Peril of Asia, which could only be addressed with conscription. The debate continued for hours until it was suggested they adjourn. Hughes thought that, if he was able to reconvene the meeting later with only pro-conscription delegates present, he would be able to win the vote easily. An account of what happened next was related by The Worker, a paper published by the Australian Workers' Union. It happened, however, and this is where the sea hath its pearls, a quorum could not be secured unless a few of the other side attended. Names were scanned and addresses looked up. 4 were sent for. They came, and they brought all the others with them. The resumption was, therefore, made with a full assembly. When the vote was taken, the Melbourne verdict was repeated. Across the country, the Labor movement was incensed. Labor executives voted down the conscription proposal. Labor backbenchers attacked it in Parliament. Cabinet ministers resigned. In September, Hughes was expelled from the New South Wales Labor Party, but remained as Prime Minister. Such was Hughes' public profile during the campaign, which saw him touring the nation to garner support for the yes side, that some considered the referendum a vote on Hughes rather than a vote on conscription. All sorts of fallacies were tried on by the yes side, from people asking, "How would the Kaiser vote?" to suggestions as barefaced as, "Mr. Hughes knows more than you, why not take him at his word?" As the vote neared, the no side began gaining momentum. Meetings and strikes were held as organising began in earnest. The vote of women was courted vigorously by anti-conscriptionists, perhaps most prominently in The Blood Vote, a cartoon accompanied by a poem which read, "Why is your face so white, mother? Why do you choke for breath? Oh, I have dreamt in the night, my son, that I doomed a man to death. Why do you hide your hand, mother, and crouch above it in dread? It beareth a dreadful brand, my son, with the dead man's blood 'tis red. Similarly, the conflict between Christian pacifism and obligation to empire was exploited to bring on side both Protestants and Catholics. While all this was going on, a massive program of wartime censorship was in place. At the start of the referendum, Hughes declared, "Everybody will be allowed full freedom of speech." Editor of the Australian Woman Voter, Vida Goldstein, wrote in an open letter during the campaign that her officers were raided by armed policemen who insisted that they must not publish certain matters dealing with war, and a quotation from Ruskin. Goldstein noted an apparent double standard at play, where the daily papers are permitted to comment on matters connected with the war, and then a regulation is rushed through which prevents any other opinion being expressed by the weekly papers, or precisely the same report in our paper is censored. Censorship regulations provided for censorship of any speech which could be construed as anti-recruitment. As the no side of the referendums was opposed to conscription, this regulation was used, maliciously or otherwise, to shut down anti-conscription speech. A month before the vote, Hughes made regulations for a program of conscription within existing provisions in the Defence Act. He said that if any men that had been called up but had not yet enlisted attempted to vote, they would get the surprise of their lives. Some had interpreted this to mean that military police would arrest any such person if they attempted to vote, while others regarded this as a tactic to scare off would-be no-voters. At the same time, Hughes created regulations to add another question for voters at polling booths before they voted, which was to ask eligible men if they had presented themselves for enlistment. On the day before the referendum, 3 ministers resigned from cabinet upon discovering this change, which they described as an undue interference with the conduct of the referendum. The latter regulations were withdrawn following the resignations. The referendum came, and for a day or two it seemed as if it could have gone either way. By the Monday, it had become clear that the anti-conscriptionists had won a bare victory. The states were evenly split on the issue, and the national vote leaned slightly against conscription. Hughes declared that the government accepted the verdict of the people, and would not legislate or regulate for conscription, but, he added, if national safety demands it, the question will be again referred to the people. In 1917, the Hughes government was re-elected. After the referendum, Hughes and other pro-conscription Labor members left and, in coalition with the Conservatives, continued in government. This became known as the First Labor Split. Hughes' treachery is still remembered in Labor circles to this day. In the midst of ever-falling recruitment numbers, Hughes declared that voluntarism has not failed for lack of men, nor because Australia is war-weary. It has failed because of a systemic campaign of poisonous doctrines insidiously disseminated throughout the country. Hughes announced that another referendum would be held on conscription. The Australian people do not like to be asked twice. To date, only one referendum proposal, the inclusion of territory voters in referendums, has been endorsed after being negative previously. As a sort of compromise, Hughes promised that the proposed program of conscription would be limited to 7,000 men a month, down from the 16,500 a month that would have been in place following the first referendum. Hughes justified this watered-down proposal thusly. Since 1916, the Allied generals have learned much. Our methods have improved. The curtain of fire, behind which the troops advanced to the attack, has been perfected, acting both as a sword and shield, and casualties have very greatly decreased. It costs less than 1/2 as many men as formerly to take a given objective. Certainly, if Hughes was giving such a sophistic rant today, he would have made reference to generative AI. The government was not only using rhetoric to further its hopes of success in the second referendum. Regulations were made which prevented citizens who were born, or whose fathers were born, in an enemy country from voting in the referendum. Exceptions were granted for servicemen and parents who had at least half of their sons join up. For the first and only time, the vote was held on a Thursday. Every federal referendum and election in Australian history has been held on a Saturday. But as this was not a referendum to amend the Constitution, Thursday the 20th of December was chosen. As Jauncey notes, the choice of Thursday, December 20th for polling day adversely affected the industrial and working classes who would not have the afternoon free for voting. The authorities refused to make the day of the referendum a public holiday. Farmers were also put to an inconvenience by the selection of Thursday as the day of the poll. Farmers usually go to town on Saturdays, and the choice of Thursday meant an extra trip for them if they desired to register their opinion on conscription. As December is a busy month in Australia on the farm, this extra trip was a special inconvenience for rural voters. In the midst of disenfranchisement, propaganda and mass censorship, we arrive at last in Queensland. Thomas Joseph Ryan became Premier of Queensland in 1915, the first Labor leader to win a majority in the Legislative Assembly. His was a prodigiously socialist government and, in some respects, the most left-wing in Australia at the time. The Queensland Labor Executive had determined that it would not pre-select any sitting MP who voted for the referendum bill. The only Queensland Labor senator to endorse the bill was Senator Henry Givens, who would later jump ship with Hughes. Of the 14 state and federal heads of government and leaders of the opposition, Ryan's signature was the only one left off of a pro-conscription message released prior to the first referendum. During the campaign, Ryan had attempted to send an anti-conscription telegram to England for Australian soldiers to consider. The Queensland Agent General, to whom Ryan had sent the telegram, replied that he had received cables 49 and 51 and asked where number 50 was. The message had been intercepted and blocked by the federal government, days away from the vote. When the second referendum campaign kicked off, Ryan and the Queensland Labor government pulled out all the stops in campaigning for the no side once again. Morals aside, Ryan had a score to settle with Hughes, both for the interception of his telegram during the last campaign and as a Labor man against a Prime Minister who had violated the Labor Party's core principle of solidarity. On the 19th of November 1917, a month out from the referendum, Ryan addressed an anti-conscription meeting at Centennial Hall in Brisbane. An account of Ryan's speech was prepared, but was scrutinised by the government censor before it was published. Far from removing elements that could harm recruitment or the war effort, the censor struck out many anti-conscription points that Ryan made. The censor, like the restrictions placed on voting in the referendum, was a tool the Hughes government used to suppress political speech that opposed conscription. If he couldn't get his speeches published through transcripts, Ryan thought, he might be able to get them published using parliamentary privilege. If he read out the censored elements of the speech in Parliament, parliamentary privilege would prevent the censor from interfering in the publishing of the speech in Hansard. This view came from no less an authority than Billy Hughes himself, who had said in response to a question in the House the previous year that Mr. Speaker is alone responsible for any censoring that may be done in connection with the reports of speeches delivered in this House, and the Speaker of the Queensland Legislative Assembly has a similar responsibility. I know of no other authority who can interfere. On the 22nd of November, Ryan moved in the Legislative Assembly that this House emphatically protests against the manner in which the censorship is being abused to suppress reports of the views of those opposing the Commonwealth Government's conscription proposals, and condemns it as an unwarrantable interference with the rights of free discussion on the platform and in the press upon one of the gravest issues ever submitted to the public, and a flagrant infringement of the time-honoured rights of a free people. Ryan kicked off the debate, which lasted for 8 hours, by quoting the censored sections of his speech and pointing out the different meaning which is conveyed by the censored version compared to what was actually said. Ryan's deputy, Ted Theodore, read 2 anti-conscription pamphlets into the record, including one which alleged that the reason for the adoption of conscription in Australia is not for military purposes, but in order to destroy the power of unionism. Theodore also alluded to another issue that had factored into the debate by declaring that White Australia will go in a fortnight. An anti-conscription argument that played effectively to the prejudices of the time was that, given Australian men would be sent off to war by conscription, labour shortages would necessitate the importation of foreign workers. The opposition moved an amendment to the motion which offered support to the federal government in every action which it may consider necessary for the defence of the empire and to prevent advantage accruing to the enemy countries by the publication of information useful to them. As in the previous campaign, opposition to any type of censorship was nefariously equated to support for the Central Powers. The opposition amendment was defeated, the motion was agreed to, and the Legislative Assembly adjourned for the day. The next morning, 2 conflicting memoranda were sent to the Government Printing Office in Brisbane. The Government Printing Office is responsible for printing copies of Hansard, as well as documents that are tabled in Parliament. The first came from Ted Theodore's Undersecretary, who instructed the government printer, Anthony Cumming, to print 10,000 copies of the November 22nd edition of Hansard, far more than the typical Hansard print run of around 2,000, with the censored material in bold type. Cumming demanded that Theodore personally authorise the printing, as the military had previously instructed him not to print censored material. Ryan later testified that the use of bold type, as well as the reading of censored pamphlets, were Theodore's idea, and unknown to him at the time. The second came from the Queensland censor and academic-turned-soldier Captain Jeremiah Stable. The censor ordered that no copies of the November 22nd Hansard number 37, were to be printed or published without permission of the censor. A reply was sent by the government printer the following day which referenced Hughes' comments regarding censorship of Hansard being the sole domain of the Speaker. He also cited an instance from the previous year where the censor was obliged to withdraw a claim to censor a speech in the Queensland Parliament, and added that, in any case, the official report of the debate referred to in your memorandum had been printed and published before I received your memorandum. The next day, Ryan and Hughes met, and Ryan warned that if Hughes sent in the army, he would need to be prepared for what would come next. Hughes had no time for Ryan or the precedents cited in Cumming's letter. On the 26th of November, Hughes made his move and personally led a raid on the government printing office, seizing thousands of copies of Hansard 37 and the type used to print them. A raid was also conducted at the General Post Office in Brisbane, where thousands more copies were seized, and the transmission of Hansard 37 by post was forbidden. Another 800 copies were seized at the offices of the Worker. This was not before, however, trade unionists delivered 1,500 copies of the Hansard by car to homes in suburban Brisbane. Ryan wrote to Hughes the next day demanding the return of the Hansard to the printer and its immediate transmission by post. There were veiled threats in Ryan's letter. I desire on behalf of my government to protest against such an invasion of the rights of a sovereign state. I am sure you must realise the great necessity of avoiding anything in the nature of displays of military force, which may inflame the public mind at a time when feeling is already running high. Hughes replied by not only denying that his statement of the privilege protecting Hansard was relevant to a case in which a state separately sets itself to defy or evade a law of the Commonwealth, but denying that Hansard 37 was a Hansard at all. It is a Hansard only in name. It is, in effect, a no-conscription pamphlet, teeming with the grossest misrepresentation. Hughes notes the bold font used to indicate the censored elements of the speech, which was without precedent in the recording of parliamentary debates. Never one to miss a chance to discount the no side, Hughes referred to 2 letters in his possession which alleged that Ryan had worked with the Queensland Anti-Conscription Committee to spread anti-conscription propaganda. The letters were addressed to 2 organisers with German surnames, which Hughes was at pains to highlight publicly. He suggests that Ryan planned to use taxpayers' money to send copies of the Hansard around the country. Hughes concluded with a threat of his own. Rest assured, if some of the statements published in your so-called Hansard are repeated outside, I shall know how to deal with them. Ryan accepted Hughes' challenge and read quotes from Hansard 37 the next day at Centennial Hall. True to his word, Hughes launched legal action against Ryan and Theodore. Hughes argued that Ryan had violated regulations made under the War Precautions Act, which made it an offence to place before the people statements calculated to mislead them in the exercise of their franchise, in relation to the referendum. The 2 sides, like entangled boa constrictors, attempted to legally throttle one another. The Queensland government took action against the Commonwealth in connection with the seizing of Hansard number 37. The Commonwealth authorities attempted a second prosecution against Premier Ryan and failed once more. Then Ryan made charges against Hughes and Hughes made charges against Ryan and Theodore. Ryan's cabinet met and decided that they needed to go on the offensive. A police guard was placed on the government printing office, and rather than Hansard 37, the printer was ordered to make 50,000 copies of the Queensland Government Gazette Extraordinary, laying out Ryan's account of censorship by the federal government and hinting at a High Court challenge at the Commonwealth's interventions. Copies of the Gazette were distributed in the streets and outside meetings where Hughes was speaking. At the same time, the Cabinet was gearing up for a fight.
Cabinet discussed serious contingencies. Plans were made to swear thousands of unionists in as special constables, to sever railway connections and block entry into the Brisbane River, and seize control of all mail and telegraphic communications via the GPO.
They had also asked the Commissioner of Police to notify the Premier of any demand made upon him to use police to carry out the behests of the Commonwealth Government. Hughes, meanwhile, had organised for the dispatch of rifles in piano cases and machine guns in big cases marked furniture to loyalists in Brisbane. Brisbane, he had been informed, was ripe for revolution, with left-wingers and unionists arming themselves in preparation to seize the city. At this stage, one mistake or miscommunication could have kicked it all off. Hughes sent a representative to the printing office, who was denied entry at the front door. The government printer let Hughes' man in, who found that no more copies of Hansard had been printed. Not much detail on this development exists, but it satisfied the Commonwealth government, who subsequently withdrew. On December 5th, during debate on a supply bill, Queensland opposition MPs inquired about reports of the pink pamphlet, without Hansard 37 on the front, being circulated extensively around Brisbane. The only comment the government made was that any of those which have been circulated were sent out of the printing office long before the raid. Despite this, the matter was considered resolved by both sides and no further conflict arose. The suppression of Hansard 37 greatly harmed Hughes' public perception and, by association, the yes side. The corruption of the franchise, the voting on a Thursday, the propaganda campaign, the censorship of opposing views, the compromise on conscription numbers, the association of the anti-conscription movement with Sinn Féin, the international workers of the world and insurrection, it was all swept away on December 20th. Despite the restrictions on who could vote, the proposition was rejected by an even larger margin. Hughes resigned as Prime Minister, only to be immediately recommissioned by the Governor-General. Hughes continued as Prime Minister until 1923, when the Country Party took the balance of power and declared it would not form a government under Hughes. For a period of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, a form of conscription known as national service was in place. The re-establishment of national service is brought up every few years, but support for the proposal in the community, as well as in the upper levels of the ADF, is low. In July 1918, statements were made about the internment of Australian citizens under the War Precautions Act in the Queensland Parliament. In the debate, Backbencher Cuthbert Butler noted that, during debate on the relevant part of the Act, Billy Hughes said that the aim of the bill is to prevent the disclosure of important information to give power to deport and otherwise deal with aliens. Australian citizens of Irish and German ancestry were being arrested, conducted to Sydney and held until the end of the war. They were not informed as to what they had been charged with, nor when their court hearing would be. One of the anti-conscriptionists with German surnames referred to by Hughes in his earlier letter to Ryan, Charles Sharker, was among those whose internment was considered by the Legislative Assembly. A Queensland Labor MP visited the Federal Parliament in Melbourne to speak with the Defence Minister about Sharker, who refused to see him or provide an explanation for Sharker's internment. Across the country, Unionists and Labor men like Sharker, along with Irish nationalists, found themselves being made political prisoners by the Hughes regime. These internments were often justified with baseless accusations of disloyalty to Australia, which were frequently debunked by the people in their communities. 2 days after the debate, soldiers were once again sent into the government printing office. Ryan sent a telegram to the acting Prime Minister, William Watt, to protest. The next day, Brigadier General Godfrey Irving, who was in charge of the raid, informed Ryan that his action was taken under a mistaken impression as to the facts. The issue was resolved when, according to Watt, the Hansard was issued with the objectionable reference deleted by the censor. Once again, the advice of Hughes that the decision to censor a Parliament's Hansard was the sole prerogative of the presiding officer had proved hollow. The first court case against Ryan and Theodore saw the charges dropped due to a total lack of evidence from the Commonwealth, and Ryan was awarded 20 guineas. The remainder of the actions between Ryan and Hughes were dropped by mutual agreement. Ryan also sued Melbourne's The Argus for defamatory articles published at the time, and was found to have been defamed, but was awarded only 1 farthing in damages. He was unsuccessful in an action against Hobart's The Mercury. Australia's constitution has no provision guaranteeing freedom of expression. 70 years later, the High Court would discover the implied freedom of political communication within the constitution. The court found that, as sections 7 and 24 refer to members of parliament being directly chosen by the people, the electors must have a degree of freedom to communicate in relation to political matters to do so. Laws restricting speech or communication in different areas have been struck down by the High Court based on the implied freedom in years since. The conflict with Hughes boosted Ryan's public profile, and he ran for the federal seat of West Sydney in 1919. This infuriated Hughes, who personally ordered surveillance of Ryan and his wife, whose maiden name was German. Ryan was touted as a future leader of Labor, but died of pneumonia in 1921, aged 45. Hughes, too, served in federal parliament until his death in 1952. His tenure of 51 years in the federal parliament is peerless. Hostilities ceased in late 1918. Leader of the opposition Frank Tudor remarked in Parliament on the announcement of the armistice, "We are all delighted that the armistice has been signed, and also that the conditions are such that it is practically impossible for the war to break out again."